Hi everyone, and welcome to Ielts Speaking. Now let me tell you what we're going to do today. We are going to look at speaking with a mask and how to do it successfully. We're going to look at the exam structure for speaking, and I'm going to give you advice for each task in the speaking section and some general Band 9 success tips. Let's begin. Now, first of all, speaking with a mask is a new thing for us, okay? So we need to be able to do it effectively. Some general tips that I'm going to give you today will be success tips for mask speaking. So first of all, you need good body posture. So you should be sitting straight so your lungs can have as much air as possible. So good posture is number one. Don't slouch over your desk, okay? So keep straight, let your lungs open up, and help you breathe appropriately. Then you need to breathe through your nose. So in and out, not through your mouth, because that will make you a little bit out of breath as you're speaking. So breathe in from your nose and breathe out through your nose. That will help you keep your breath as you're speaking, because speaking for 15 minutes with a mask continuously can be difficult. So these first two tips will help you with your breathing. Now, in order to be heard correctly, you need a dramatic voice. So try and be dramatic as you're speaking with your mask, because obviously it's harder for them to hear you, so you have to be dramatic. Now, how can we do that? We maintain good eye contact with our examiner. It shows we're confident speakers. We have hand gestures. So keep your hands above the desk, not below the desk. So keep your hands above the desk and constantly move around appropriately with your hands to show what you mean, just like I'm doing right now, okay? So that's a very, very good tip to show that you're confident, okay? So that's another thing that's very important. Then we need here to speak loudly and to speak clearly, because the mask does prohibit. So if you see, if I cover my mouth, you can't see how my lips are moving. So what do I need to do? I need to speak loudly and clearly. So pronounce all your words clearly enough, because the mask will prohibit your sound. Now, the best thing to do is to practice speaking with a mask for up to 15 minutes, which is like the total length of the exam. So have a few practice sessions speaking for 15 minutes with the mask. Check your posture and your breathing, okay, to make sure you're correct. Maintain eye contact, use a dramatic voice, keep the tone up and down, don't keep it monotonous, don't keep one tone. Tone should move up and down to show excitement and interest, okay? So it'll keep everyone's interest. Make sure your hands are moving in the appropriate way to show your confidence, and speak loudly and clearly. But practice makes perfect. Right, so now we're going to look at the actual test. The test takes 15 minutes. It's a one-to-one interview with the examiner, and it has 3 parts. Now I'm going to show you the 3 parts before I zoom you into the slides for each section. Now, part 1 is a short question and answer section, some basic questions about everyday life, which require only a short answer. Part 2 is a monologue, a speech, where you have to speak by yourself for between 1 and 2 minutes. And part 3 are longer questions and answers based on the theme of the card. Now, part 1 is a short question and answer section. So they'll ask you a very brief question, a very easy question, based on personal topics, things like your family, your friends, your school, your work, your country, your city, your neighborhood, anything personalized, something relatively everyday, okay? So an everyday topic. Now, let's have a look at more details. Now, you should use full sentences when you reply, even though they should be short. So yes, no, because, or this, because, and keep it brief, okay? We don't want any details in this section. We'll save the details for later in part 2 and 3. So here it's a short question with a short answer, but a full sentence. Not very small things, okay? So we can use contractions. We can use any short forms we want. I'm, your. So it's a very, very natural speaking exam. You can use colloquial phrases. They like that in the exam. So just keep everything very relaxed, very natural at the beginning. Here, they're actually just trying to see how good your English is and how natural it comes to you. So show them that you are a natural, relaxed English speaker in this section, okay? Let's move on. Now, popular topics, pause the video, and it'll be good if you can find some topic-specific vocabulary for each of these topics as well. So, pause the video, make a note of these popular topics for part 1, speaking. And now we'll move to sample questions and sample answers. So you can see here I have a nice short question, and here I have 3 sample answers. That's how short they should be. Yes, no, because, or this, because, or this, but this. So you have a little look at these questions and answers, just so that you can see how I would reply to this question in these 3 possible ways. All 3 are equally okay. All right, so pause the video if you want to have a look at that in more detail. So question and possible answers for part 1. Now we're going to move to part 2. This is where things get a little bit more challenging. Now, part 2 is a monologue, which means you speak by yourself. Okay, so this is always a little bit challenging for people where they have to have a continuous speech. But don't worry, there are always little hints to help you. Now, it takes from 3 to 5 minutes. 3 is usually the minimum, 5 is usually the maximum. Now, you're supposed to describe something. Describe a place, a person, an event, an idea, any kind of description. Usually it's something about the past, but you could be speaking in more general terms as well, okay? So you're going to have a card with some bullet points, and you have to cover each of those bullet points in your speech. Now I'm going to go into a bit more detail now. I'm going to show you a sample card. Pause the video if you want to look at it in more detail, but here's your sample card for part 2. So they give you the card and they give you these bullet points here, so that you can use those bullet points in your answer, and you must cover each one of those bullet points. Otherwise, you will lose marks, okay? Now, very important, when they give you the card, you have 1 minute to plan what you would like to say. So they give you thinking time, and you can actually write on the card or on a piece of paper some basic notes, okay? So you have a minute to plan what you would like to say with your notes. So you can look at your notes as you're reading, as you're, doing your speech afterwards. That's fine, okay? So I would recommend writing small phrases only for your speaking section here, because you don't have time within a minute to write full sentences, and it's hard to look at your sentences as you are speaking. So you just quickly look and see the words and phrases you've written, and it helps you just develop your speech from there. So don't write a full speech in a minute. It's impossible and very, very hard to read, because don't forget, you're supposed to be speaking naturally during this section as well, okay? Right. Let's have a look at how to make notes during this section. Now, the first thing you need to remember here, okay, the notes will be next to the bullet points. Okay, so each bullet should have something written next to it, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second, okay? I would underline keywords in the question so that I'm sure that I'm answering it correctly, okay, that I'm not going off track at any point, okay? And I'd use time phrases as well. Things like yesterday, last week, when I was young, when I was 5. I'd use some time phrases for this, okay? So this section, as part of your notes, use some time phrases to help you keep track of everything, okay? Now let's go to my sample notes. So for the card that you saw earlier, here are my sample notes. You see I've circled certain words. I've written 1 or 2 words next to each bullet so that I know that I'm going to cover all those points. And while I do my speech, I would look at the card and develop my speech using my notes. And you see I've underlined the topic as well, so that I know that I'm not going to go off track, okay? Now, because you only have 2 minutes to speak in this section for your monologue, you've got to make sure you cover all those points first, and then, if you have any extra time, blah, blah your way through it. Say, oh, I remember the last time I did this, this happened. Or I remember how I felt when this happened. So you do a bit of blah blahing just to fill up the last few seconds, but do not surpass 2 minutes. It's between 1 and 2 minutes, not less than 1, not more than 2, okay? So save the blah blah for after. Cover the points first, okay? So if you want, pause the video and have a close look at my notes, okay? Now, more information about our notes here, as you can see. Now, if you can't remember a word, what should you do? Paraphrase it. So if you want a specific word like plant, you can say it looks like a tree, but it's smaller and it's green. So you don't have to actually say the word plant. Remember, it's a communication exam. So if there's a word you can't remember, at least you can communicate that word in another way. Or use a simpler word for it if you do know one, okay? And also use your imagination. Examiners love imaginative thinking and they recommend it. So don't get stuck and say, oh, this has never happened to me before. No, don't say that. Use your imagination. You've seen many movies, you know many people, you've read many books. It's possible to use your imagination here, okay? So use your imagination. Just say something. Don't leave the examination room and say, oh, I should have said that, I should have said that. No, use your imagination on the spot. On the spot thinking is the best training you can have before you go to the exam, okay? Unknown topics, unknown things, all right? So you need to be fully conscious during your examination. You don't want to have a silent moment. That's not good, okay? So no silence, keep talking, okay? Always say something. And it's okay to correct yourself. If you've realized that you've made a grammatical error or you've said something that doesn't make sense, you can correct yourself. Even native speakers do that, okay? So you say something, say, oh, I apologize, I meant this, okay? So if you use the wrong word or anything like that, correct yourself. That's fine. They don't mind people correcting themselves. All right, now opening and closing the monologue, an introduction and a conclusion for the monologue. So just like an egg that opens and closes, you also need to have an introduction that opens it and a conclusion that closes it. So here you'll see a possible introduction and a possible conclusion. So if, for example, they ask me to describe a famous person, how would I open my sentence? A famous person that I really admire is da-da-da. And how would I close it? That's why I really like this person. Or that's why I really admire this famous person. So as you can see, opening and closing your monologue is very important. Okay? So if you want, pause the video and have a closer look at this example. Right. Now you only have 2 minutes for your monologue. Not less than 1, not more than 2. So time yourselves to make sure that you don't surpass 2 minutes, because we do lose marks if we're under 1 minute or over 2. So make sure you stay within the time limit, okay? Now, the actual speech. Use all the bullet points and don't be afraid if you have a follow-up question session with the examiner. So if you haven't given enough detail during your monologue and the examiner wants to know more, they may ask you a couple of follow-up questions based on what you've said. So it depends whether they want to know more or not. And make sure you're using correct grammar. Now, what I've noticed when my students go for the exam, the students that go with the best grammar get the highest marks because their fluency continues perfectly. There are no breaks in their sentence structures. So make sure your grammar is good before you go there. Okay, so have good grammar and then go to the exam. Everyone who's gone with, let's say, less developed grammar has received a lower mark. Okay, so grammar is important because your sentence structure adds to your fluency and your meaning. Okay, so what's your grammar? Right, now some advice. Record yourself while wearing a mask. I have mentioned this before. Okay, record yourself while wearing the mask. So record yourself and see about different topics, see how much you can say and get used to how much you can say within those 2 minutes. So at home, record yourself, and the best time really is 1 minute and 50 seconds. 1 minute and 55 seconds is pushing too much towards 2 minutes. So 1 minute and 50 seconds should be what you're aiming at time-wise for the monologue. So time yourselves at home while practicing, record yourself, listen back, and see if you've made any dramatic errors with your grammar and your pronunciation. and make sure that you can stay within the 2-minute time frame. So recording yourselves at home is key, okay? Right, okay. Now some general tips for part 2 and for part 3 really. The first one, use words that you're familiar with, okay? Don't experiment at the examination, okay? Don't experiment with new words. Stick to the words you know, even if they're not so advanced, okay? The examination room is no place for experimentation because you're being graded there and then. And if you use a word in the wrong way, you will lose marks, okay? Now, there is some topic-specific vocabulary you can look up. These are very popular topics. So if you want to impress the examiners with some nice big words and some nice formal words, you can easily do it by searching topic-specific vocabulary. So these are the topics that you should research because they're very popular on the examination. Okay, so make a note of these words. If you want, pause the video and do so. Right, the next tip, good grammar. I've already mentioned this. Good pronunciation. So you have to be very, very clear on your pronunciation. You can't pronounce things in an entirely wrong way. So pronunciation is very important. It's not the be-all and end-all, but you have to be able to say the words clearly, okay? And you can pause to think by using any of these expressions, okay? Any of these phrases will help you gain a couple of seconds just to think about a topic. So you can say something like, oh, I've never thought about this before, possibly, and then just come up with something at that moment. So don't just go blank or say, okay, don't do that, don't do that. Use one of these phrases just to gain yourselves a couple of seconds to think about what you would like to say, okay? And no long silences, as we've said. Right, I've already mentioned this, but no fillers. No, well, don't do that. Don't do that. Are not appreciated in the exam. It shows that your mind is going blank. So don't sit there saying, no, okay? No ums. That's like the big no-no for the Ielts exam, okay? So don't use these fillers, all right? Use the previous ones in the previous slide, okay? Right, detail. Detail is very important in part 2 and part 3. So we need to have enough details in these 2 sections to gain enough marks, okay? Part 1, no, but part 2 and 3 need details, all right? Now, this is very, very important actually. Don't use a monotonous tone. Don't speak like this and no, you bore the examiner and you put the examiner to sleep. You need to be lively. You need to be full of energy. You need to smile. Even under your mask, they can feel the warmth of a smile. Your eyes smile with you, and smiling always gives you that positive vibe. Range your voice, higher, lower when you get more excited. Be animated, be dramatic. Especially since you're wearing a mask, you need to be able to be dramatic. Use hand gestures as well to show your excitement or to explain something. It shows that you're comfortable, you're confident, you're not afraid. So this is a very, very important point, okay? Hand gestures, dramatic voice, smile so your eyes can smile. All of these things are essential, okay? Especially now that we're wearing masks in the examination room, okay? And keep your voice loud, okay? And pronounce your words clearly as well, because the mask does prohibit a lot of these things from coming across, all right? So number 7 is key. Now, what are they actually marking? Your fluency and coherence, your vocabulary use, your grammar, and your pronunciation, okay? So all of these things are important. This is the grading system for part 2 and part 3 especially, okay? And you should be working on all of these things. Right, let's now move to part 3. Part 3 is the part that most people are more afraid of because it requires a lot more detail and a lot more professionalism, okay? So it's a detailed and professional discussion with the examiner. You have a theme that is linked to part 2. So if they talked about buildings in part 2, they're going to talk about construction in part 3. If they talked about famous people, they're going to talk about famous people also in part 3. So part 2 and part 3 are linked in this way based on their theme. But part 3, they ask you a question that is longer and more complex, maybe the advantages and disadvantages of something. Maybe they ask you to describe something that is related to a building. So you have to bear that in mind, that part 2 and part 3 are thematically linked. Now, they want to know opinions, they want a professional discussion, they want examples as well. So you have to give examples and details in part 3. Your knowledge is not as important as your communication skills. So don't worry if your opinions are not something that they would like. As long as it's not some neo-Nazi crazy idea, you know, or some very racist thing that you would say, as long as it's nothing so bad, you'll be fine, okay? So don't worry if your ideas are not popular. It's not a knowledge exam. It is a communication exam. As long as you explain yourself and give an example to prove your point, you will be fine in this section, okay? So remember, your opinions are not as important as your ability to express your opinions in this section, okay? Right. Now, we give details. We give examples to back up our ideas in part 3. We can ask for clarification if we didn't understand the question well enough. You can say, what do you mean by this? And they can rephrase it. Or can you please rephrase the question? Or can you repeat the question if we haven't heard it clearly enough? Because it will be longer than the other questions that you're used to. Part 1, for example, had very short questions. Part 3 has much longer questions with bigger words inside. So you can ask for clarification. You can ask them to rephrase the question. You can ask them to repeat the question. Now, you're aiming for your answers to be about 30 seconds long. They don't have to be exactly 30 seconds, but they can be. That's like your maximum. They shouldn't be more than 30 seconds, all right? Because the exam only takes a total of 15 minutes, so you don't have time to elaborate even more. But do give examples and do back up your examples with an explanation. So you make a point, you give an example, and you explain how that example helps you prove your point, okay, for each question. Now, don't be afraid if the examiner starts debating with you. That's a good sign. They want to challenge your opinion. They want to make you not lose your cool, but they want to see how you can answer under the pressure of a debate. So they might debate with you to play devil's advocate. Okay, so don't be afraid of that. That's a good sign. Okay, right. Now, here are some important phrases you can use in your speaking exam. Pause the video and make a note of these phrases. And now, when you don't know the right word to use, here are some little words that can help you do that. Okay, now, as I've said, practice at home, record yourself, listen to yourself. Okay, wear a mask while you do that. Especially for part 2, the monologue, get to know how much you can say in those 2 minutes, and everything will be fine. Good luck.